Well, I want to thank Kathy and Marcos, obviously, and all the folks at KPFK for their sponsorship and support for this event, as well as the staff here at Midnight Special. Vanessa Cropper, thank you very much as well. And I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I know that your time is often limited in the busy world that we live in, and you've got a lot of choices to make, and I appreciate you being with us here this evening. I wish I had a pleasant, uplifting topic to talk about this evening. But unfortunately, we're going to be a little bit serious on our program tonight. Just very quickly, by way of background, to amplify just a little bit on what Marcos and Kathy had to say. As some of you may know, my wife Robin and I worked at the Central Intelligence Agency as imagery analyst for just a little bit over 8 years, from 1988 to 1996. And in the course of our service at the agency, as well as my wife's tenure on Capitol Hill during 1994 during the Senate Banking Committee investigation, we became aware of a very serious problem within the executive branch as it pertains to potential chemical agent and biological agent exposures among our troops during and after Operation Desert Storm. And I can always blame my wife for this because she's the one who, who wound up getting me involved in this. In late 1993, my wife began a fellowship program, the Women's Executive Leadership Program. It's an Office of Personnel Management leadership training program for up-and-coming women in the executive branch of the United States government. And part of that program involves going to different offices of the federal government in order to get an idea of exactly how they work. Well, my wife was looking for something a little unusual to do in this circumstance. And she found out that the Senate Banking Committee was looking for some staffers to help with their ongoing investigation into U.S. chemical and biological related exports to Iraq during and before the Gulf War, to try to determine whether or not there might be a link between these illnesses being suffered by American veterans and those particular exports. And when my wife came back from her initial interview with the Banking Committee in late January of 1994, she walked in the door waving this report and said, "Take a look at this, I think we got gassed." And I looked at the report. It was about 65 to 70 pages long, and it was largely anecdotal, but it was very, very powerful and very convincing. And most of all, it was very disturbing. Reading that report brought back a lot of memories for me, because during Desert Shield and Desert Storm, I was on a team of CIA imagery analysts who were routinely looking at the incoming satellite imagery of Saddam Hussein's forces as they invaded Kuwait and then threatened Saudi Arabia. We subsequently monitored the buildup and then the actual war itself. And it was during that particular period of time, particularly in January and February of 1991, that a series of messages, primarily from American military intelligence channels, came across our computer screens indicating that perhaps the Iraqis were actually using these agents during the course of the war. And at that time in 1991, my comrades and I were 7,000 miles from the theater of operations, and thus we had no independent way ourselves of confirming or denying what was going on. And every time that we would go to our management chain during the war and ask that question, "Hey, we just saw this report about gas being used, is this true or false?" the response would come back from Schwarzkopf's headquarters without fail: "No, false alarm, don't worry about it, nothing's going on." Well, we were not ourselves in a position, being at this particular facility, looking at the satellite imagery, to actually get in contact directly with the troops to confirm or deny, and that really wasn't our job, quite frankly. So you fast forward now to early 1994 with my wife waving this report in front of my face saying, "We've got a real problem here." And I read the report and I really began to realize that there may well be a correlation here. And that was in early February of '94 that I made the decision to go ahead and begin to reconstruct all of the available evidence that I could find that might indicate that our forces had in fact been exposed to these agents. And that involved going into CIA databases, using keyword searches, pulling up this information. It involved ultimately talking to a lot of veterans myself. Up to this point in time, I've personally talked to over 500 Gulf War veterans. During my wife's tenure on the Banking Committee staff, she talked to well over twice that number. And the stories were always the same with regards to the illness, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But what was really compelling for me was about the 10 or 15% of these personnel who had absolutely credible stories about detecting chemical agents at very low levels once the bombing campaign started in mid-January and for a considerable period of time thereafter. So I began to try to amalgamate all this data and really take a look at it. And while I'm doing this within the CIA, my wife is working on the Senate Banking Committee staff as they also investigate this particular issue. And they're talking to veterans, and they are gathering evidence, and they are querying DOD officials about exactly who knew what, when, and where. And they weren't making a terrible amount of progress in many respects because DOD was stonewalling them. And in fact, it was in this particular March to May 1994 period that I really began to understand what was going on. My wife came home from work one afternoon and told me that the Department of Defense, specifically the Office of the Secretary of Defense, had called the Senate Banking Committee asking for the list of witnesses that the Banking Committee intended to call for their upcoming hearing. And the Department of Defense was claiming that they simply wanted to interview these people and find out what they might actually know. Well, in fact, the Department of Defense initiated a witness intimidation program against these individuals, calling each and every one of them, telling them that their testimony would be refuted, telling them that they did not see what they believed that they saw, in some cases actually going so far as to claim that Iraq did not have the means to even deliver these chemical weapons, which was, of course, totally ridiculous. So we had this very clear pattern emerging of the Department of Defense doing everything it possibly could to try to shut this operation down and squelch any attempts to really look into this. Well, by July of 1994, I had really reached the conclusion that there was an actual conscious effort to cover up what had happened, to try to deny what had actually taken place. So I wrote a lengthy, probably about a 2.5 or 3-page classified memo from my immediate supervisor in which I outlined a lot of what was known during and immediately after the war about these chemical agent incidents, at least those incidents that were recorded within the intelligence community's own databases, at least those that I had access to. And I also gave my immediate supervisor 2 copies of the 25 May 1994 Senate Banking Committee report, which was very exhaustively researched, had all these witnesses that I just mentioned a while ago who had testimony with regards to these chemical agent detections. And I just put it to him very simply. I said, look, there's this giant body of information out here that indicates that something happened in the Gulf. And we have people like William Perry, who was then the Secretary of Defense, and John Shalikashvili, who is still the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, telling the Banking Committee in writing, that no information existed, classified or otherwise, to indicate that any of our troops had been exposed to chemical agents or that any of these kinds of incidents had ever happened. And I told him that it was my view that the agency would be making a giant mistake to go along with DOD on this one. I told him I felt the agency should not only reopen the issue, but that the agency itself should send sampling teams to Kuwait to try to collect soil samples, analyze those soil samples for breakdown byproducts of chemical agents to see whether or not they could confirm or deny. Well, instead of asking me, why, Pat, do you believe that senior officials are lying about this, he gave me the 3rd degree about misusing government equipment for what he perceived to be a private research project. And I made it very clear to him that, when anybody joins the federal government in either a civilian or a military capacity, you take an oath. That oath is not to an individual agency, it is not to an individual man, it is to you, the people. It's to the Constitution of the United States. And in my view, looking at the evidence that I'd accumulated and that the Banking Committee had accumulated, it was absolutely clear to me that we had serious malfeasance taking place here. People were lying. That's a word that folks in Washington really don't like you to use. They don't like that L word. You could try to sugarcoat it and say that they misled, as my attorney prefers for me to say, for libel reasons. But when you get right down to it, they lied. Now, why? Why are they lying? Why did they make the decision to try to play this thing down and not deal with it in an open and honest fashion? I think that you can gain a lot of insight into that, first of all, by reading the book, because in the book I go into ad nauseum detail about statements that were made by such luminaries as Colin Powell, several secretaries of defense, other senior officers, to include Schwarzkopf, about how none of these agents were ever detected and there was never any evidence that any of these attacks had taken place. And the reality, of course, is that the Department of Defense's own records show exactly the opposite. Many of you have probably heard about the controversy swirling around the United States Central Command's nuclear, biological, and chemical log, the magical missing log. That particular log, in my view, is not missing, and I'll tell you why. When that log was first declassified in June of 1994, about 25 or 30 pages were passed out to certain members of the press, and the claim was made that, see, we're being open and honest about this process, we're making the data available, essentially. Well, now we find out in early 1997 that at least 175 pages of this log or thereabouts were destroyed by this mysterious computer virus. The interesting thing is, somehow this virus went from Tampa, which is where the original copies of the log were kept, to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, and managed to wipe out both copies of this log at exactly the same time. And wouldn't you know it, those paper backup copies of the log, they're gone too. Well, I found it really interesting when I sat down and I looked at the declassified portions of this log, because for the declassifying authority, on the very bottom of the page, it said OSD/C3I. Now, that's intelligence community lingo for Office of the Secretary of Defense, Command, Control, and Communications. That meant that the log was actually declassified in William Perry's office. And there is, in fact, a third copy of the magical missing log. And as a result of the second lawsuit that we filed earlier this year, just about a month ago, a new page for this log suddenly appeared. Obviously raising the question, how many more new pages will appear over the course of the next 3 to 6 months or a year or whatever. Now that's just one example of many that are documented in the book about how the Department of Defense, and to a lesser degree the Central Intelligence Agency, have played fast and loose with the facts, how they have attempted to suppress information, and in the case of the Central Intelligence Agency, in February of 1996, attempted to reclassify information, despite the fact that attempting to do that is in violation of the executive order governing the classification of those kinds of materials. And the only way that we were finally able to get that data out into the public domain was to file our first lawsuit in October of 1996. And we did that because I included a lot of this so-called banned data in my manuscript. You'll find a lot of that in the book. And I did that because I knew that the agency would attempt to excise that information from my manuscript. And they did. On September the 20th, 1996, they sent me a letter stating that, these passages are going to have to go. And it was less than a month after that that my attorney filed suit in federal district court and said, try again. 8 days after we filed the suit, the CIA caved and gave in on each and every one of the particular deletions that they were seeking as they related to those, quote, banned documents, end quote. And I think they caved because they knew they did not have a court case to stand on. They knew they had no chance of winning this if it actually went to trial. But it didn't stop them from doing it. And one of the most outrageous things that has happened since we have gone public back in October of 1996 is that just this past April of 1997, after months of vehement denials, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified an additional 50 documents detailing potential chemical agent exposures among American personnel at this facility in southeastern Iraq called Qamishiyah, which many of you may have heard about in the news since DOD actually admitted to that incident back in June of last year. When my wife and I went public in October of 1996, we told Phil Sheenan of the New York Times specifically that we were absolutely certain that the CIA had separate information on this subject being held in very tightly compartmented channels. And that is exactly what it boiled down to. If you take a look at some of those documents that are now on the internet, and I would refer you to DOD's GulfLink internet website, you will find those documents out there. And what's really interesting is to look at the distribution list for the folks who got those extremely highly classified, very sensitive documents. They included George Bush, Colin Powell, Norman Schwarzkopf, Dick Cheney, the people at the upper echelons of our government during the Bush administration. So it raises fundamental questions about integrity in our government today And that's really what I've written here, is kind of a contemporary tale about Washington morality or lack thereof. And in the introduction, I talk about some of the lessons that I've learned from this entire episode. You know, I learned how the CIA really works. Essentially, the CIA in the late 1990s has become an institution that is largely bureaucratic and self-protective. It has developed a siege mentality, and any information that is damaging to the agency itself, it seeks to suppress, even if that information is decades old. And I want to take just a moment to talk about one of the most recent cases. Michael Scott is someone who works here in Hollywood. His father was a CIA case officer, a human spy, if you will, with the agency under State Department cover back in the 1950s and 60s. And Michael Scott did not learn about his father's real past until relatively recently. What he also found out was that his father had put together a diary, if you will, a manuscript for all intents and purposes, and that when his father died in the early 1970s, the CIA seized that manuscript. And to this day, Michael Scott has not been able to get the complete manuscript from the Central Intelligence Agency. They continue to cite reasons of national security. Now, in my view, that's utterly absurd, because Scott's father was a case officer in Mexico City back in the late 50s and early 60s. So any of the assets, as the agency calls their spies, any of the assets that would have been active in Scott's portfolio would long since have passed from power within the Mexican government. They would no longer be of any real intelligence value. So the agency has no grounds to stand on, in my view, to continue to classify that data, yet they do. And it's really reflective in many respects of how out of touch the CIA is, and that's why our experience, I think, is kind of the culmination of that dysfunctionality of the agency. Because in what we discovered, this was not a case, however tragic, of one particular citizen, in this case I'm thinking of Jennifer Harbury, having to try to get into the agency to get information about what might have happened to her husband down in Guatemala. That was outrageous enough. What we have uncovered here is a deliberate attempt to suppress information that affects people that live in your community, people that live in my community, all across this country. Now, we are the taxpayers for this organization, and most importantly, these Gulf War veterans are the taxpayers for the Central Intelligence Agency. They paid my salary when I worked for them, and they're still paying the salaries of the people that I left behind, the people that have refused to deal with this issue in an open and honest way. And ultimately, I think you have to question the continued rationale for the existence of the CIA if it has become so utterly out of touch with the people who pay the salaries of the folks who work there, that when they have information that has a direct bearing on the health and welfare of over 100,000 of our citizens, they will still refuse to play ball and declassify that data in the name of, quote, national security. So that was the first powerful lesson that I learned from this. The other lesson that I've learned from this, and one that causes me a great deal of rage, is how the Congress truly works. You know, I saw one of our guests this evening who had Ronald Kessler's latest book, Inside Congress. I highly recommend that you read that book. I know I shouldn't be up here plugging somebody else's book, but it's just too bloody good. It's too bloody important. I really urge you to read that, because it will give you a sense of how depraved the Congress as an institution has become. And my wife and I had firsthand experience dealing with that. As you'll read in the book, in March of 1995, at the request of the former Senate Banking Committee investigator James Toote, I took roughly 100 still classified documents to Capitol Hill to the Senate Intelligence Committee staff. And I laid those documents on the table in front of the Chief of Staff, a man by the name of Charles Battaglia, who figures rather prominently in my book. And I looked at him and I just put it very simply to him. I said, look, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our top military leader, and the Secretary of Defense, our top civilian over at the Pentagon, both say that there's no information, uncaveated statement now, no information, classified or otherwise, to indicate that any of our troops may have been exposed. And I took the documents out of the envelope and I laid them out in a fan-like sheath, and I said, this is just some of the information that those two gentlemen claim does not exist. And Mr. Battaglia only had one question for me. He asked me if there was any evidence that attacks had occurred against American forces. And I told him yes, and I took him to about half a dozen specific documents, most of which originate with the National Security Agency, that clearly indicated that something had happened. And he said, "Thank you very much, we'll be in touch." And they never were. And I can tell you that I faxed letters of protest to the Senate Intelligence Committee when John Deutsch was nominated to take over the Central Intelligence Agency, because John Deutsch had been Bill Clinton's point man in dealing with this issue while at DOD. Veterans organizations like the National Gulf War Resource Center, which has endorsed my book, also sent letters of protest. Many individual veterans across the country sent letters of protest. But Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Arlen Specter refused to deal with the issue at all, essentially. John Deutsch was asked one question and largely let off the hook on this entire thing. And the Senate Intelligence Committee voted 17-0 to confirm Deutsch, despite serious questions about his integrity as this issue is concerned. And the full Senate voted 98-2, I believe, to confirm Deutsch. That experience left an indelible impression on me about how the Congress truly functions. You know, when Kathy introduced me, she talked about the fact that they've had Congressman Christopher Shays of Connecticut on their program on at least one occasion. I testified in front of Congressman Shays' subcommittee back in December of last year, and while it was an interesting and in some respects rewarding experience, it also demonstrated to me again very forcefully the limits that the Congress has essentially imposed on itself in dealing with this issue. And what do I mean by that? For most issues that I think we've seen in our lifetime that are this big, Watergate, Iran-Contra, for example, you will have joint congressional committees that will be established. They'll have members of the House and the Senate, usually from as many different committees of jurisdiction as pertain to the problem as possible. And that committee will have full subpoena power, not only to call witnesses, but to get documents. Yet for the last 4 years, we have had a recurring pattern of what I call one-day show trial hearings, in which certain rather prominent members of Congress, Arlen Specter being the most notorious of those, will call a one-day hearing. They will have perhaps a few extremely ill Gulf War veterans get up and give extremely heartbreaking testimony. And then we'll have absolutely no follow-up after that. No legislation is introduced. No one from the Department of Defense or the Central Intelligence Agency or the Department of Veterans Affairs is held accountable for what they've done or failed to do in dealing with this issue. And that, I think, shows, as nothing else can, the absolute dysfunctionality of the Congress. It is absolutely outrageous that this entire problem has been allowed to go on for 4 years without the leadership of the Congress, whether it is Republican or Democrat, sitting down and dealing with this issue in a genuinely serious fashion. The story that I told you earlier about the witness intimidation program being run out of an office in the office of a component, excuse me, of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's a violation of 18 U.S. Code. You are not supposed to be out intimidating federal witnesses. Yet the Justice Department has done absolutely nothing to go after the individuals within the Defense Department who are responsible for that. And since the Department of Justice has failed to deal with it, one would think that the Congress, in its oversight responsibilities, would at least look into the matter. And they've done nothing. And I can't begin to tell you the amount of rage and frustration that Gulf War veterans feel because of this kind of inaction. There is absolutely no way for me to really put it into words. Whenever I go and speak to Gulf War veterans, as I did down in Raleigh, North Carolina over the Memorial Day weekend, the sense of rage is so palpable you can almost cut it with a knife in the air. It is absolutely unbelievable. It's simply palpable. And I can understand why. I can understand why because the Department of Veterans Affairs, which I haven't talked about up to this point in time, has also been incredibly negligent in dealing with this particular issue. There are certain doctors within the Veterans Administration who have gone out of their way to try to help these veterans. One of them is here with us tonight, but I don't want to identify him and cause him any potential problems with his erstwhile employers.
I've been there too.
But there are half a dozen VA officials, physicians for the most part, who I know personally, who have been retaliated against repeatedly for attempting to assist Gulf War veterans, for giving diagnoses that are not politically correct, if you will. And a politically incorrect diagnosis in the VA is a diagnosis of chemical or biological agent exposure. The number of veterans who are seeking help from the VA is in the tens of thousands. The last figure that I saw was in excess of 100,000 who have sought assistance from the VA or signed up on the Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs registries. And in the course of my wife's work on Capitol Hill, she and her colleagues were of the opinion that that was a gross understatement, because for every veteran who feels that he or she can come forward and be identified with his illness, there is at least one other veteran standing behind that person who cannot come forward because they are still either on active duty and they don't want to lose their job in that respect, because if you admit you have this illness and you're on active duty, you're marking your time until you're discharged. They've been very, very ruthless in that respect. But those who have actually left the military and have re-entered civilian life, folks that are, let's say, police officers, or perhaps medical professionals, or who work on city councils, they don't want to admit that they have this problem either, because again, there is a stigma in some quarters that gets attached to this illness. And a lot of that has to do with the policy that the federal government has adopted towards these folks. A lot of that policy now being driven by the Presidential Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses, who in January of this year, when they issued their so-called final report, seemed to attribute most of the problems that these veterans are suffering from to stress. Well, the last time I checked, stress does not cause brain lesions. Stress does not cause people to get enlarged organs at the age of 28. Does not cause people to drop dead at the age of 30 from kidney failure. The notion that this is all in their heads is an absolute insult. Having said that, I don't want to minimize the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder or forms of depression playing a role in the illnesses of a certain select number of veterans. I would not want to minimize that, because that is a very real illness. But at the same time, it strains credulity to suggest that 1 out of every 7 individuals who served in the Persian Gulf is ill because of some kind of psychosomatic disorder. Yet that is what the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Presidential Advisory Committee, and the Department of Defense would have you, the American public, believe. But there are certain doctors, as I indicated, within the Veterans Administration, as well as outside the federal government, who know differently. And many of them have finally been able to get a lot of their research published. Some of the best research being done on this is down at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center with Dr. Robert Haley and his team looking into the potential effects of chemical agent exposures among American forces. But there are others who are investigating this as well. Dr. Howard Ernovitz at Calypti Biomedical, and there are others. Dr. Nicholson with the Institute for Molecular Medicine in Irvine, California, has also got a theory on this. There are those who have questioned the validity of that particular theory, and if you want, we can get into that in some more detail in the question and answer session.
Excuse me. Okay, I'll wait.
But having said that, the one thing that's very clear to me from having dealt with over 500 of these veterans in the course of the last 3.5 years is that these people are sick with real illnesses. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And in the end, I think that brings us back to the real reason why the federal government doesn't want to deal with this right now. Because if they have to admit that either through our own actions, i.e. the bombing of these chemical and biological storage sites and the resulting fallout that blew down over American forces, that our troops were exposed, or that the Iraqis themselves in some circumstances used these agents, or a combination of the two, to have to admit that would mean that we lost the Persian Gulf War. And people like Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf have spent a great deal of time over the last 6 years painting this as, quote, a clean win, end quote, to use Powell's words from 28 February 1991 at a Pentagon press conference. A lot of people have got a lot at stake in terms of their reputations, professional and personal, as a result of building this up to be essentially a cost-free war. And in fact, when General Powell was asked to testify before Senator Specter's show trial committee back in April, Colin Powell was not placed under oath, by the way. General Powell continued to make the point that, well, we only suffered approximately 147 or 148 killed in action, and that this was a low-casualty war. And it struck me that General Powell apparently has not been to a VA clinic lately, because Dr. Catherine Murray Leisure, who has been working with the VA for a considerable period of time in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, has over 700 ill Gulf War veterans in her clinic alone. And as I point out in the book, ultimately, I think a lot of the federal government's resistance, and the Pentagon's resistance especially, in admitting what really happened here, stems from the fact that it would destroy the idea that this was a clean, quick, casualty-free war. There's one thing that I've learned in the course of my life, not just through my own family's military experience, but my experience at the agency, in particular with this issue. There is no such thing as a casualty-free war. What makes this war different is that the casualty effects have been delayed because of the kinds of exposures that these individuals experienced. And there's a growing body of medical evidence that clearly indicates that exposure to these kinds of agents, particularly low-level exposures over a long period of time, can have very serious medical consequences, particularly from the cognitive standpoint: memory loss, motor skill coordination degradation, things of this nature. And what I found truly outrageous, just unbelievable, was when I began to research this, I found a report in the CIA's library, a report that the Brooks Air Force Base in Texas had put together during the Gulf War. That report dealt with a study using rhesus monkeys that were exposed to the chemical agent Soman, a chemical nerve agent that was known to be in the Iraqi inventory, over a 5-day period. And at the end of that particular test, the researchers noted clear behavioral and cognitive deficits in those monkeys. Now, the reason that they did those studies was because they had a stated concern about the potential bio-effects of repeated low-level chemical exposures. Yet when I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to Brooks Air Force Base in January of this year, seeking that report, which I already had, as well as any others they may have put together on this particular issue, the response came back in February: no such studies of that nature exist. At that point, I put together a letter that I addressed to the Secretary of the Air Force, Sheila Widnall, who you've undoubtedly heard about lately because of the Kelly Flynn affair. And in that letter, I said, "Dear Madam Secretary, not only do these studies exist, but here's the cover page for the first one, and here are the abstracts for the others I've been able to find. And oh, by the way, if you don't turn these over to me, I will add you to my lawsuit." Magically, about 6 weeks later, a stack of those studies appeared in my mailbox from Brooks Air Force Base in Texas. The absolute lack of integrity being demonstrated by the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Central Intelligence Agency in this matter is simply mind-boggling. And it's something that is very difficult for many people to grasp. It's very difficult for many people to believe. It was certainly very difficult for my colleagues in the CIA to believe. They did not want to entertain the notion that their principal client, the Department of Defense, was engaged in this very kind of activity. And the CIA has as the Department of Defense as its primary client, in large measure, thanks to General Schwarzkopf, who after the war made a series of very disparaging and largely inaccurate statements about the CIA's support or lack thereof to his command during the war. And the agency reacted to that criticism by creating an entire new office within the CIA called the Office of Military Affairs. It's staffed by several hundred people, and every single day they bring in at least 10 to 20 military visitors to give them complete tours of the CIA, tell them everything that the CIA can potentially do for them. That adds up to 5,000 or 6,000 people a year, by the way. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing. You know, you'd like for your primary intelligence organization to be sharing the information that accumulates with the Department of Defense to make sure that if they do go and have to prosecute a campaign in Korea or Iran or somewhere else, that it actually gets done right this time. But what it has really done is corrupted the agency. Because the agency was established in 1947 not to fight the Cold War. At that point, there was no Cold War. The agency was established to prevent another Pearl Harbor. It was established because military intelligence had failed before Pearl Harbor. The agency is supposed to be an independent voice, providing independent analysis and advice to the President and the Congress and the Cabinet. And what the agency has done is sell its soul. But in the course of my research, I found out it wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time. The parallel that I discovered was that another CIA analyst by the name of Sam Adams ran into this very same problem during the Vietnam War. This book is dedicated in part to Sam. He worked for the agency between 1963 and 1973, and during that period he was the U.S. government's foremost expert on the Viet Cong during the war. In 1967, Adams figured out that General Westmoreland, who was the commander of American forces in Vietnam, was lying about the true size of the Viet Cong enemy. That in fact there were probably twice as many Viet Cong facing the American field army as what General Westmoreland and his staff were telling the President and the Congress and the public and the press. Adams tried for over a year to get the CIA to confront the Department of Defense on this issue. And ultimately, they refused to do it. He went all the way to the Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms. And Helms caved. He simply would not confront Lyndon Johnson with this information. The price was paid in blood during the Tet Offensive. If the CIA had confronted the Department of Defense, and most importantly the President, with that information, how many lives might have been saved at Tet? Tet might not have even happened. Might have been preempted. But the agency sold out then, and now a generation later it sold out another generation of American veterans. And of all the lessons that I think I've learned in this entire thing, it's that in the late 1990s, the agencies of the federal government that deal with these kinds of issues have just simply lost touch with reality. They've forgotten who it is that pays their salaries, who it is they're really supposed to be working for. And that's tragic because there are still some damn good people who work at the CIA, who work within the Department of Defense, who work within the Department of Veterans Affairs. But those people, unfortunately, are trapped in systems that have become ossified, corrupt, and ultimately incapable of fulfilling their functions under the Constitution and prevailing statutes. So having said all these terribly depressing things, what do I have to say that's reasonably hopeful and uplifting and perhaps provides some hope for resolving some of these kinds of issues? Well, first off, we'll talk about the veterans and the medical aspect of this and why I think there is some hope. Some of the research that's underway today, I believe, will ultimately lead to some treatment protocols and regimens that will be able to provide at least a measure of assistance to these veterans. The problems are complex. They involve cognitive problems, obviously, the memory loss and motor skill coordination issues. There are also a lot of veterans who are suffering a tremendous number of unusual infections and recurring viruses and other kinds of problems of that nature. That's going to require a slightly different medical approach. But I think, at least in the private sector, the research underway down at University of Texas and Calypti Biomedical here in California and elsewhere is probably going to provide the veterans, most importantly, with some answers and hopefully with some treatment protocols. They will not live as long as the rest of us will, unfortunately, because of the kinds of exposures that they suffered. But I'm hopeful that with independent medical science working on this, so long as the federal government does not get in the way, there will be some answers for these people and hopefully some treatment. I am substantially less optimistic, unfortunately, about the state of the federal government today, and particularly the national security bureaucracy. I believe that unless there are some radical changes within the national security bureaucracy, particularly changes having to do with how officers are recruited and trained and the kind of values that are imparted to them, we are going to have repetitions of this circumstance. We are going to have repetitions of troops being told, no, you didn't see that, burn the logs, we don't want to hear about it. We're going to have repetitions of witness intimidation programs and things of this nature. And we're going to have repetitions of troops being forced to take experimental drugs because the Food and Drug Administration has granted a permanent waiver to the Department of Defense to use these kinds of investigational drugs. That is what the Department of Defense is currently seeking for using this pyridostigmine bromide, or PB tablet, which was a nerve agent pretreatment medication that the troops were supposed to take when the war began. That particular medicine has never been tested on healthy people. It is only supposed to be prescribed for a very specific neurological condition known as myasthenia gravis. And the troops that were forced to take this had no alternative, despite what Norman Schwarzkopf told the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee in January of this year. I cannot tell you the number of Marines and the number of Army personnel that I've talked to who have said, we were told if we did not take this medication, we would face judicial punishment. In the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or the UCMJ, they were looking at what are known as Article 15s, which can be administrative or they can be very, very punitive, leading to the loss of one's career. So facing that kind of sanction, tens of thousands of these troops of ours took these tablets and in effect became human guinea pigs. And now the Department of Defense wants to institutionalize that practice. I submit to you that that is no different in many respects than what Adolf Hitler and his minions did to the Jews in the concentration camps. When you are violating the fundamental tenets of the Nuremberg Code by trashing informed consent, you are, in my opinion, a war criminal. And those are not... That's not simply my opinion. That's what Senator Jay Rockefeller said earlier this year. And I'm hopeful that Senator Rockefeller and his colleagues in the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee will finally begin to really put some teeth behind their words. I think at this stage of the game, it would probably be fair to go ahead and pause and take some questions. This pretty well ends the prepared set of remarks that I've got. If anybody's got anything, I'd be happy to take it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you mentioned that something about Dr. Nicholson, but there was an article in the LA Times, and I have 3 dogs, and I got one dog I'm concerned with the contagion of the Desert Storm, and I got a dog from a neighbor of a Desert Storm person, a veteran, and then I got the dog, and it's got like doggy AIDS. She's got lesions in her gums, and she's got losing her hair. I mean, really losing her hair, not just shedding. And the person that sold me the dog, she's got all the same symptoms. And this is what the article was, is that it's extremely contagious and that the healthcare workers have come down with it. All their animals have died. The one doctor's lost teeth. His wife couldn't walk. It was on Extra. They interviewed some people. And that's my concern, is the contagion of it and how you can be tested for it.
For the benefit of those of you who might not have heard the complete question and query, the issue is Gulf War syndrome highly contagious? And the questioner referenced a 9 March 1997 front page article that appeared in the LA Times here that quoted Dr. Garth Nicholson of the Institute for Molecular Medicine, essentially claiming that the mycoplasma that he has identified, and that's a specific type of microorganism, the mycoplasma that he has apparently identified in a large number of Gulf War veterans has somehow been genetically altered by the Iraqis and actually represents a biological agent that was used on American forces. I can tell all of you here that my wife and I have had a number of Gulf War veterans and their spouses into our homes over the last 3.5 years. They have drank out of our glasses, eaten off of our plates, and we are completely healthy. Now, having said that, I will tell you that there is virtually incontrovertible anecdotal evidence, and when I say anecdotal, I mean several hundred, if not several thousand. There is a tremendous amount of evidence, quite frankly, that there is a transmissibility issue for close family members. Now, what does that mean? I'm not a medical professional, so I'm not going to get up here and give you a spin, as some people might. What I will tell you is that Dr. Catherine Murray Leisure of the Lebanon, Pennsylvania VA Medical Center is of the opinion that our troops may well have also contracted during their experience in the war a previously unidentified microorganism, a bug, if you will, that may be native to the Arabian Peninsula, that because American troops had never deployed there before, they had no natural immunity to it, and thus they became vulnerable to it. In Dr. Leisure's experience, based on my conversations with her, it does not appear that this is in any way, shape, or form necessarily highly contagious. But there is a concern there. And that's why I do talk about it, I do address these kinds of issues, but the thing that I want to stay away from is beginning to create any kind of an impression that this thing is highly contagious, that you get it the same way you get the common flu or common cold. That simply does not happen. There are people that are investigating this. Dr. Leisure is one of them. There are others who are looking at that particular aspect. And I'm confident that over the course of the next year or so, they'll have some answers in that respect. But it is something to be concerned about. And it's something to be concerned about for another very important reason. And that's because of the kind of fear and paranoia that kind of talk can create. And quite frankly, I took Dr. Nicholson to task recently for that very thing, because he's been quoted repeatedly in the Associated Press, LA Times, and even in some very right-wing publications, such as the McIlvaney Intelligence Advisor and elsewhere, publications that are associated with the militia movement, by the way, indicating that, or making the case essentially that this is somehow highly contagious. When you make a statement like that without actually having had any of your work peer-reviewed or replicated elsewhere, which to this point in time Dr. Nicholson has not, although the United States Army has pledged to do that, when you make a statement that this may be highly contagious without having the necessary facts to really back it up, you create paranoia. And in the days immediately following the appearance of that LA Times article, I can't tell you the number of telephone calls and email messages I got from veterans or spouses telling me that, well, now they won't go near my husband at work, they won't sit next to him at work, they've moved into a separate office, so on and so forth. And in fact, the man and wife couple that I talk about in the first chapter of my book experienced exactly that kind of thing. That is simply irresponsible on the part of any medical professional or anyone who claims to be a medical professional to make a statement like that without having had the data analyzed by others, peer-reviewed, and published in major respected journals. And that's why I'm glad that you raised that particular issue, because it is something that I think most people need to be concerned about.
I played a skeptic of that. I said, yeah, they have a mental problem. Let's understand what we now know the symptoms. We're not quite sure of the cause and effect. But let me throw two things out. Typhoid, what I call the typhoid Mary syndrome. Look at how, when AIDS first came out, look how people were now treated, and all of a sudden we segregated the whole population. And I think we can draw a parallel between those two.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. Another question here basically asking, are we drawing parallels here between the kind of hysteria that was created over potential AIDS, the ease of AIDS transmissibility back in the early to mid-'80s, and this particular syndrome. And I am very deeply concerned about that, because clearly it's going to make it even more difficult for Gulf War veterans to get proper treatment and to function as normally as they possibly can if they have this additional stigma attached to them that they are somehow modern lepers, if you will. So yes, I'm very, very concerned about that. Yes, sir?
Over the last 6 months, there have been a number of congressional hearings where, and some of them reported by C-SPAN, where people from the Defense Department say, yeah, we're going to clean our act up. What have you seen to give one confidence that there's been some kind of transformation?
The question essentially is, has the Defense Department changed its tune in the last 6 months? Have they ceased attempting to intimidate veterans into silence? Have they ceased playing games with information and things of that nature? What I will tell you essentially is what I say in the introduction to the book, which is this. I have found that the United States Marine Corps has dealt with this issue with more integrity than any of the other services at all. In fact, better than all the other services combined. They are the only component of the armed forces that has dealt with this well at all. And as far as the senior leadership of the Pentagon, I have not seen any change whatsoever in their behavior or their conduct to lead me to believe that they are now genuinely serious in dealing with this issue. And that's very disturbing. It's obviously, it causes rage among the veterans, And this happened again most recently when they declassified this new page from the CENTCOM log and attempted to explain it away by saying, oh, it was stuck on somebody's desk. When you continue to lie to people often enough, even the slowest ones will catch on after a while. Yes, sir.
I'm a Gulf War veteran myself, and you talk about some of the cover-ups. I'm also an advocate for the homeless and the veterans. And a lot of them were asking me a question, and we also heard while we were down there, that there was some type of compensation that was given to each troop from various countries, from the King of Saudi Arabia for helping us protect his country, and the United States, it was abolished here. Do you know of any cover-up?
That's a very interesting question for those of you who again, were not able to hear precisely. The question was, what happened to all the money, essentially, that the Saudi Arabian government was going to be paying the United States for us coming over there and basically bailing them out? I don't have a good answer on that one for you. My understanding was that the Saudi government was supposed to pay the United States government for that. So far as I know, those payments took place, at least some of them did. But whether all that money's been accounted for, unfortunately, I really cannot speak to that at this point in time. Yes, sir.
I can answer this question. I'm a former Marine myself, and I spent 8.5 months in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, 3 months in northern Iraq and Turkey. I was a reconnaissance unit. And what we were told, they did offer money, but our government turned it down because they said we're not paid killers.
Exactly.
So that's the answer.
Well, I know that the Australians I spoke to, they received theirs and a few troops in
Yeah, maybe
England.
other countries, but that's...
Right.
Ma'am, you had a question?
Yes. Could there be a larger cover-up at stake than simply covering up evidence of military nerve gas exposure? And I'm thinking more in terms of, well, back in August of 1994, my husband and I sustained an organophosphate compound poisoning. And so at that time, I did quite a bit of research into these kinds of compounds and came across studies put out by the Walter Reed Army Medical Institute that made me think about Gulf War syndrome being this kind of illness. And I've connected with other people who've been poisoned domestically.
Yes.
And the same thing has happened where when it comes to county and state authorities, nothing gets investigated, it gets covered up, and it has to do with agriculture and the chemical corporations, that there is a great protection of organophosphate pesticides, and in the case of, well, ceramic salmon, those aren't pesticides, but those are compounds. Now, I had come across at least one study that led me to believe that soldiers would not have even had to come across the military nerve gases to become ill. Came across a study that showed potentiation effects that can occur between just pesticides in the campgrounds combined with the prophylactic treatments that they were receiving. So could there be even a larger cover-up? And I can see that that's why then Congress would not be acting.
To very quickly reformulate the question and statement, are there larger implications here? Are there even larger reasons why the federal government would not want to deal with this particular issue? And this questioner has raised a very legitimate concern in that these compounds that we're talking about that were potentially used and that our troops were exposed to in the Gulf, these chemical nerve agents, are the very close cousin of many of the pesticides that are used throughout the United States. And that's why, for those of you who may be sitting here tonight or watching on C-SPAN and elsewhere, if you're wondering, you know, Pat, this is tragic. This really just is horrific. But how does it affect me? What our questioner has just raised is the silver bullet. It affects all of us because whether you own a home or you live in a development where you've got a homeowners association or whatever, if you're out there or your association is out there putting down these pesticides during the summer season, and you're out there putting insecticide on yourself when you're doing your barbecue, are you putting yourself at risk for some of these same kinds of cognitive problems, same kinds of neurological problems that these veterans are suffering from? The answer, in my view, is an unequivocal yes. As our questioner has indicated, there is a growing body of research that indicates that this is the case. And one particular researcher that I'm thinking of who's looked into this is Dr. James Moss, who was in fact a contract employee with the U.S. Department of Agriculture until 1994, when he discovered in the course of some of his research that a combination of pesticides and insect repellent, when applied to cockroaches, killed them just like that. Well, he wasn't with Agriculture Department very long after he figured that one out. And that has huge implications, as our questioner has very clearly and eloquently articulated. If you've got the Chemical Manufacturers Association involved in trying to suppress that kind of data, yes, it has implications for each and every one of us when it comes right down to it. Yes, sir.
It's along the lines of that question. In northern Iraq, in the mountains, we were issued bug juice, and we lived in it for like 3 months in the mountains. And I mean, 24 hours a day, because the bugs were so bad, they would climb through our nets, and they were hell. So we lived in this stuff. So what kind of information has come out on that? I mean, in addition to the amphetamine pills and those things in the other arena.
I would imagine that I could probably point you in the direction, and perhaps the woman sitting in front of you could even point you in the direction of a number of studies that address that particular issue. I think we may be getting a little bit technical here, and I don't know that I want to go into quite that much detail. But clearly, you're talking about man-made substances. They're not natural substances. And if you combine those kinds of things, you're going to start to get some problems. And there's another book, and I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's another book that I would urge everybody here and everybody watching to read. It's called Toxic Deception. It's been put together by the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, and the authors are Dan Fagan and Marianne Lavelle. And this book is the best expose on the chemical industry that has ever been written. And it addresses some of the very issues, ma'am, that you raised. How the chemical industry distorts the entire political process in order to keep very dangerous pesticides on the open market. It is an eye-opening book, and I urge everyone to go out and get it.
The name of it again?
Toxic Deception.
What's the name of the other one you mentioned earlier?
Inside Congress by Ronald Kessler. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I was going to ask, why didn't the gas masks work? They were showing pictures of all our troops with the gas masks. What happened to that?
The question from the back was, what about the gas mask that our troops were wearing? No, she's not a plant, but I'm so glad she asked that question. One of the things that I found in the course of my investigation is that the gas masks that the majority of our Army and Marine Corps personnel were wearing during the Gulf War had a failure rate of between 26 and 44%. The replacement masks, the M40 series masks, have a similar failure rate because they're made by the same manufacturer. At least in my opinion, that's a big reason why. So that means that for those folks that were at the Camisea ammunition depot, for example, when that was blown up in March of 1991, even if they had been wearing their masks, anywhere from 2 to 5 out of every 10 of those personnel would have been exposed anyway, would not have made any difference. One of the other things that I talk about in the book are other chemical and biological defense equipment shortages, and those of you who are in the Gulf, who are here tonight, can probably testify to the fact that at best you had one chemical overgarment that was issued to you the entire time you were there, and you wound up wearing that chemical overgarment probably 2 or 3 times beyond its expected shelf life. Now when you do that, you break down the protection and bingo, you get an exposure scenario. So even low-level exposures, again, become an issue because of that breakdown in chemical protective gear. And you had a follow-up?
Also, didn't some of the soldiers get sick from the vaccines or that they took, or the tablets? Did the tablets actually make some of them sick?
The next question was regarding both the vaccines and the nerve agent pretreatment pills. Did those cause, or do those appear to have caused illnesses in the veterans? Dr. Thomas Teat is an individual who testified in front of Congressman Shea's committee back in April of this year. He is an expert in pyridostigmine bromide, and he has got a bibliography on studies that have been done into PB over the course of the last 25 or 30 years that show that it's very toxic when it's given to individuals who don't have this myasthenia gravis neurological disorder. As far as the vaccines themselves, that's another very interesting question, and that's one that I believe Dr. Ernovitz at Calypti Biomedical here in California has been looking into, whether or not giving live vaccines to these folks may have caused some immunological dysfunction and problems. And it would not surprise me that that was the case. I believe there's going to be additional research forthcoming from Dr. Ernovitz and his outfit that will probably address those particular questions.
What kind of scares me is I just can't get over that syphilis story where they gave the men in the Army and said they're curing them, and now they're just, now it's been over 30 years.
15 years, yeah.
Yeah, and they're finally, it's like 30 years, and they're finally apologizing. 30 years, it's like 2 people left. The Panama Deception, that wonderful film, and you talk about, the first thing I thought of when that Berlin Wall came down is the Iron Curtain worked 2 ways.
Yeah.
And I, you know, what we did in Panama, you know, Grenada, you know, we're not any better than they are. And when they gave radiation to these people, they isotopes in their food because they decided that these were worthless people. They judged that these people were not productive members of society, so they put that in their food.
And our questioner has again raised this issue of informed consent and the idea that people can be exposed to things by the federal government, whether they're soldiers or civilians, without them really knowing about it. And I'm going to do it again. There's another book you need to read. In addition to mine, please do buy mine. But the book is entitled The 11th Plague. Its author is Dr. Leonard Cole of Rutgers University. It is an outstanding book dealing with biological warfare. Dr. Cole has authored several books, and he deals in great detail with the kinds of biological tests that were conducted over American cities by the U.S. Army for about 25 years, using what they called simulants, quote, unquote. These were supposed to be materials that were not toxic and not harmful to man. Well, if that's the case, why did they ultimately ban the use of every single one of them? That's a question that Dr. Cole addresses in his book, and again, I'd urge you to read that one as well. He's written some other things. Clouds of Deception, I believe, is the title of the book, but definitely The 11th Plague. That lists some of the other works that he's done that deal with this particular subject. Sir?
You mentioned your lawsuit, which I assume is under the Freedom of Information Act.
Yes.
Has there been an attempt to bring a lawsuit for the for the Gulf War veterans?
The question.
And I give you a hint. I think they're covered by federal workers' compensation.
The question is, are there any lawsuits pending currently that Gulf War veterans are a part of, other than the kind of Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that we have initiated on our own? The answer is yes. There is a major class action lawsuit that's been put together by Pitts and Associates, I believe it's a Houston-based law firm. They have about 4,000 Gulf War veterans who are part of that suit. They are trying to sue the manufacturers of the chemical equipment that was sold to Iraq during the 1980s as a result of the Reagan and Bush administration's policies. Don't know where that one's going to end up, but I will say that I hope they're successful, because under sovereign immunity at this stage of the game, they really don't have the ability to effectively sue the federal government.
There's another loophole. That's why we'll talk to you after. I need to get some email addresses.
Okay. Any other questions? Sir?
The other day in the LA Times, there was another mention of the morale of the CIA being so low, as if they hadn't brought it on themselves. But isn't it sort of a difference between the mass of workers there being betrayed by the managers, the appointees?
The question essentially is there a difference within CIA in terms of the average working analyst having one set of particular values and the management of the CIA having substantially different values? I wish that were true. But as you will read in the book, what I found and what I think is different today than what it was 30 years ago in the agency is that the kind of moral vacuousness and analytical corruption has made its way all the way down to the analytical ranks. Because we tried every way we could, my wife and I. When I use the royal we, I mean my wife. We tried everything that we could to get people at the analytical level, the worker bee is just like us, to engage on this issue, because that's where these battles start. That's where they start. And they just did not want to deal with it. They did not want to engage on the issue of DOD lying about this. And what was really outrageous, and this just sent me through the roof, when I sat down with CIA analysts for the first time to discuss this issue in detail on February 17th, 1995, I laid out for them all the evidence that we had, with a special emphasis on what our own Gulf War veterans had to say about this. People who were trained to detect chemical agents, who did so repeatedly during and after the war. And immediately, they said, we're not going to look at that. That's not, quote, intelligence information. And they practically had to peel me off the ceiling. I said, what are you talking about? These are our citizens. They fought on a foreign battlefield against a foreign enemy. How much more foreign does it get? And no, that's just not intelligence information. We're not going to engage on that. That was totally hypocritical, because throughout its entire existence, the Central Intelligence Agency has had a component that does nothing but debrief American citizens about their travels and their experiences overseas. This component, and I can't identify it by name, it used to be called the Domestic Contact Service. That's as good as I can do. That particular component is one of the most efficient and effective components of the CIA, precisely because they go and talk to American citizens who aren't looking to get paid off, like an Iraqi or an Iranian or a Russian or whoever. We get incredibly reliable and accurate information from our own citizens traveling overseas. Well, no great shock there. So the mechanism for them to go out and debrief all these Gulf War veterans was right there, and they refused to do it. And I document all that in the book. So I wish I could tell you that, yes, there's this giant dichotomy between the analyst and the managers. 30 years ago, that was probably true. The man who wrote the introduction to my book is a 28-year CIA veteran who knew Sam Adams, the man that I referred to earlier. And he was struck by what I had to say in terms of how much agency culture has changed over the course of the last 30 years in that respect. And that's why they really do not serve the people's interest anymore, because we've had so many. A lot of these problems, I believe, began with Bill Casey, because Bill Casey brought in a lot of people who were essentially politicizers. Whatever the Reagan administration wanted them to say or do, they were willing to do that. And that continued with the Bush administration, and it continues to this day, because Bill Clinton, obviously, is only picking people who are going to give the party line where Gulf War syndrome is concerned. So I wish I had better news for you, but unfortunately I don't. Yes, sir, in the back.
I'd like to first of all thank you for your presentation and your courage coming forth with your book.
Thank you.
As disturbing as the news is, there's also, in particular, those veterans that have been adversely affected and their families. An issue that really continues to ring home to me as I listen to the presentation is something that has disturbed me for some time, is that notion of no person being above the law. And clearly, the CIA is an agency that is not held accountable to anyone, or, more importantly, the Constitution of the United States, which is very troubling to me. But the question I have for you is, I agree with your point on how those people who were made into heroes took this war and sold it to the American people a long time before the war began through the mass media. What a job they did. They sold us a bag of goods. The American people bought it. How effective have you been in trying to present your message to that same mass media that helped the government sell their message?
To reformulate the question just very quickly again, have my wife and I and others who were allied with us been effective in countering DOD's spin and propaganda that this was a highly successful war, a casualty-free war, et cetera, et cetera? I think in the last 6 months we've taken giant strides. I think our going public really helped to rip the mask, or at least begin the process of really ripping the mask off of this thing and to show it for what it really is. And I think as long as we're able to continue pressure in the courts and in venues like this, we'll continue to see progress on it. Is it coming as fast as I would like? No, not at all. Because I talk to veterans every single day. I've watched several of them slip away over the course of the last several years. And that hurts, because when you develop relationships with these people, they become a part of your life. And I served for 11 years. I was an enlisted man, an NCO, and an officer, so I've seen it from all three sides. And I don't have, obviously, any tolerance for what's going on. I think we have been effective. I think that we will continue to do everything in our power to be as effective as we possibly can.
What do you think about Senator Patrick Moynihan's efforts to dismantle the CIA?
The question is, do I endorse Senator Moynihan's call for the absolute abolition of the CIA? To a degree, I call for that in the book, but I think maybe a better way to look at this is to re-ask the question as a two-parter. First off, does the United States in the late 1990s need a strategic intelligence organization for national security purposes? My answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. When you look at things like the World Trade Center, when you look at the proliferation threat, particularly the terrorism proliferation threat, as evidenced by the Japanese cult attack in the Tokyo subway system in 1995, strategic intelligence is something that this country absolutely has to have. We didn't have it before Pearl Harbor, and it got 2,500 people killed in one afternoon and got us into a 4-year war. So there's no doubt in my mind we need a strategic intelligence organization. Now the second half of the question is the CIA the right organization to do the job? I think that's an open question. At this stage of the game, I would probably be inclined to say that it's better to just get rid of the bloody thing and start over. Because as ossified and as bureaucratic as it has become, I'm not sure that it's salvageable in its current conditions. Certainly it's not salvageable with a man like George Tenet at the helm, who in my view perjured himself in discussing this issue during his confirmation hearings, and who provided the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee with false and misleading testimony when he testified back in February. That sends a message. When you tell the troops it's okay to lie, you know, what's their incentive? Unless they happen to be kamikazes like myself, you know, what are they going to do? A lot of people have got mortgages. A lot of people have got kids. I can tell you that I knew one source who worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who I was quite confident could put some extremely damaging information in my hands. But that individual ultimately declined to work with me because of those very kinds of fears. And it happens every day. But because we now have about 80% of Gulf War veterans out of the military, and we're being contacted by more and more every day, we're finally beginning to piece together most of what happened. And as I indicate in the book, this is just the first cut. This only deals with one slice of this issue. There's a lot more to come, and I'm working on the second book now. Yes, sir?
Has this problem affected recruitment?
Within the U.S. Armed Forces? The question is, has the Gulf War Syndrome controversy impacted U.S. military recruiting? Yes, and the Secretary of Defense himself has said so. Several senior officials have said so. And it should affect recruiting. When you lie to people repeatedly, they tell their friends, they tell their family members, and especially they tell people who are thinking about joining the American military. And I can tell you that virtually every one of the leaders of the Gulf War Veterans Movement, and there are at least 25 or 30 groups that are scattered across the United States from California to Maine, who are constantly telling what would be draft age males and females, don't join up. I take a little bit of a different approach to that. I tell people, if you're going to join anything, join the Marine Corps, because my experience has been that for the most part, the Marines do take care of their own. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Krulak, told one Gulf War veteran that, in his opinion, most of the troops were exposed. So he's been pretty stand-up about it. In the time that I've spent investigating this issue and dealing with Gulf War veterans and dealing with Marine Corps officials, I very rarely get the runaround. They tend to do a pretty good job. And your follow-up?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he's direct and honest about it afterwards doesn't really reduce the danger of these troops, whether they enlist in the Marines or other services, from the obligation to take medication which can cause disease in which they have no right to know anything about and no right to refuse. I mean, the CIA may be corrupt, but the fact is that the Pentagon okayed this policy. It wasn't the CIA that did it. Anybody enlisting faces this risk of permanently harming themselves.
Our questioner has raised, once again, the issue of informed consent with regards to military enlistments these days and what folks might encounter. Will they be told, in essence, if they go into combat with a potentially chemically armed Iran or North Korea or Iraq again, that they have to take those PB pills, those pyridostigmine nerve agent pretreatment tablets? That is a very real concern, and that is why I want Senator Specter and Senator Rockefeller and the folks on the House Veterans Affairs Committee to pass legislation making that illegal. That's their job. That's what they should be doing. And they have failed to do so thus far. And I have to tell you that that was one of the most frustrating things that my wife and I encountered in trying to deal with some of these committees on Capitol Hill, because these committees tend to be populated in their staffs now, and the staffs are really the ones who make policy. That's one of Washington's dirty little secrets. Many of these staffers are retired or reserve senior officers sitting on these committees of jurisdiction. For example, when Senator Nunn was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, his chief of staff was a brigadier general in the Marine Corps Reserve. Now, I liked the guy. I thought he was a great guy. But isn't that a conflict of interest? You're sitting on a committee of jurisdiction, you're a staff member on a committee of jurisdiction, and you're supposed to be conducting oversight of the organization that provides your reserve check? That's a little bit of a problem. And we have the same problem with the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee. I talked about Mr. Battaglia earlier. Mr. Battaglia, who is still Arlen Specter's chief of staff on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, he spent time with the CIA. A number of people who work on both the House and Senate Intelligence Committees are former CIA or Defense Intelligence Agency staffers. And I will tell you that when we briefed the House Intelligence Committee staff in December of 1996 about our allegations, I got the third degree from one particular staffer who worked in the CIA's Director of Operations for at least 10 years. Needless to say, that gentleman and I did not see eye to eye. So that's something that I have a great deal of concern about, where this whole congressional question is involved. When you've got former staffers and former retired military personnel sitting on these committees of jurisdiction, it makes it very difficult to get things moving. That's why I applaud what Representative Shays is doing, because he does not suffer that problem. You know, he's the chairman. He's charging off on his own, essentially. He has the blessing of the House Government Oversight Committee chair himself. But we need more than just Congressman Shays to be involved in doing this. And we need... Oh, I would urge everyone who's watching this or listening tonight to call Arlen Specter's office. And if you want to call the Capitol Switchboard, that's 202-224-3121. And just ask them to connect you with Senator Specter's office. Call Senator Jay Rockefeller. He's the ranking minority member. Senator Rockefeller actually did do a number of relatively useful things when he was the chairman during 1993 and 1994. When he was chair of the committee, they did a great deal of research into the pyridostigmine bromide issue, questioning DOD's conduct in actually using the tablets. But he's another one that needs to receive a telephone call. Bob Stump, who I believe is still the chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, he needs to get a telephone call. The Republicans especially need to get the telephone calls because they are the majority party now. They are the ones who control the purse strings, they control the committees. They're the ones who need to hear from the public and from the veterans especially. Yes, ma'am.
I want to underline the writing members of Congress also makes a huge difference. They don't get a lot of handwritten letters, and they do pay attention to them.
That's a very good point brought up by our questioner. If you're going to contact Congress, I would urge you to both call, email, fax, write, the whole 9 yards. Because when they get that avalanche of mail, that is when they begin to pay a little bit of attention to what's going on. And that's what these veterans desperately need right now. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the CIA has really drifted from its original intent. In your opinion, this has been speculated, but what do you think is What they really have to
Loaded question there. The question from the audience was, if I believe that the CIA has drifted so far from its mandate, what do I believe they feel their mandate is? And at this stage, I think their mandate is self-interest and self-survival, because the agency has been under intense criticism now for about 6 years straight, whether it was coming from General Schwarzkopf, coming later on from Jennifer Harbury as a result of the murder of her husband and another American citizen. The Aldrich Ames affair obviously has caused a great deal of damage. And I still empathize with some of my colleagues to a degree because they have developed somewhat of a siege mentality. But as someone in this audience has pointed out, the Central Intelligence Agency has unfortunately brought an awful lot of this on itself. And tragically, it's only one component of the CIA that has really been responsible for this, and that's the Director of Operations. But you know, in the end, you can only cast stones at the CIA for so long, because ultimately the CIA and its leadership take their orders from the President of the United States. And the CIA does not undertake a covert action or do anything without the President of the United States authorizing it.
You know, I have to talk to that, because in the CIA's own Inspector General report, for example, on the Castro assassination plots, they admitted that they did not tell the President, that they undertook this on their own authority. So although I think that's largely true, it certainly has not always been true by their own admission. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Other than the embarrassment of exposing themselves as having lied about the win in the Gulf, what do you feel are some of the other repercussions of admitting that this happened? You know, if you have the war itself was several years back, people have short memories.
Yes.
They can sort of say, well, we kind of sort of won, we accomplished this and this and this, and yes, yes, there were some problems. What are the financial repercussions, the costs, medical costs? Could you speak to that?
The question from the audience basically is, what are the additional costs of the Gulf War that the federal government and the Department of Defense really don't want to deal with? And there are obviously a number of them. When we talk about having at least 100,000 Gulf War veterans who've been affected by this, having to pay those folks in terms of compensation over the course of a lifetime is going to be a very expensive proposition, especially in these budget-constrained times that we're living in. There's another aspect to the money equation, though, and that comes down to the problems that I cited earlier in the chemical defense equipment that our forces are still using to this day. To fix those problems would also be a very, very expensive proposition. In order to get chemical protective equipment that really works, it could wind up costing them the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars, for each particular type of suit that these folks might have to wear on the battlefield. They might ultimately come to the conclusion that they'll have to wear a self-contained breathing apparatus in order to operate in that kind of an environment. And I say, if that's what it takes, so be it. Let's stop spending money on B-1 bombers that never flew during the Gulf War and that have been hangar queens the entire time that they've been in the Air Force inventory. And let's spend a little less money on Nimitz-class aircraft carriers that I'm not sure we need all that many of anymore. And let's put our money into making sure that our troops have gas masks that work, chemical protective suits that work, and enough of them. That's one of the other scandals that I uncovered in doing the research for this book. 3 days into the air war, January 20th, 1991, the on-hand quantity of replacement gas mask filters in the Marine Corps sector was 0. And that situation persisted almost throughout the entire period of the war. So, if Saddam Hussein had employed these weapons in a massive way, in a First World War kind of analogy, if you will, American and coalition casualties would have been horrendous, because they would not have had the replacement suits, masks, or filters to make up for the losses. So when we're still looking at a chemically armed Iran, a chemically armed North Korea, a chemically armed Libya, and Iraq still undoubtedly hiding major components of its chemical and biological weapons programs, and that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of the United States government, they have a lot of incentive to play this thing down. A lot of incentives. But the reality is, if these deficiencies are not exposed, these problems debated, we will have another, what amounts to chemical and biological, Pearl Harbor in the future. I would submit we've already had one, as the Gulf War was it. But we could have a much worse scenario in the future if the problems that we talk about here in the book are not properly addressed. Yes, sir.
What's your view on the justifications for having to join in the Gulf in the first place? The way we did it, when we did it, or even for the war itself?
The question from the audience is basically, what's my take on why we even went to war in the Gulf to begin with? I will tell you that at that time, and I still today believe, that it was necessary to go to the Gulf because Saddam Hussein, if he had been allowed to overrun the Saudi Arabian oil fields, would have become the single most powerful dictator on the planet. And having Iraq control basically 50 to 60% of the world's proven oil reserves would have given him the ability to basically destroy the American economy. Now, having said that, the reality is that in many respects, the United States government was directly responsible for Saddam Hussein being able to invade Kuwait to begin with. And as the Senate Banking Committee investigation showed, and subsequent investigations have shown, a tremendous amount of dual-use American chemical and or biological related equipment and materials made their way into Saddam Hussein's arsenal. And I can't help but be struck by the parallels between that and the United States selling scrap iron to Japan in the late 1930s and early 1940s that came back as bombs and torpedoes on our ships at Pearl Harbor. The parallels are really very stark. In many respects, the Gulf War was a disaster that we made happen by our own policies during the 1980s. And that's why I strongly believe that the United States government is fully culpable and responsible for taking care of gentlemen like these that are in our audience tonight. Yes, sir.
Just one question. Can you address the issue of the fact that the possibility of the Saudi Arabian government funded partially funded the Iran-Contra gun running?
The question from the audience is, can I speak to potential Saudi Arabian involvement in the Iran-Contra affair and the Saudi Arabian government essentially helping to bankroll that? I cannot. I came to the agency after Iran-Contra, and I never had any actual dealings with that particular issue. But as an aside, I think we all know that the Saudis have a tremendous amount of wealth. They're a key U.S. ally in the region, and the United States government has often called upon key allies in the region to assist us in executing whatever foreign policy the current head of state decides is best for the United States. So my short answer to your very simple question, it wouldn't surprise me. Yes, ma'am.
What about the comment by Mrs. Thatcher in '93 before the World Affairs Council that we have to clear the planet of 1 billion people by the year 2000? Now, you know, Mrs. Thatcher has been influencing the United States for years and years and years.
Well, the question...
And so they do what she says.
Bush did.
They do what she says.
Well,
they do it.
The question from the audience is, what kind of potential influence has Margaret Thatcher had on U.S. foreign policy? I don't think there's any question that she had a great deal of influence on George Bush in August of 1990 in getting him to go into Kuwait in the first place. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I can comment in any kind of detailed manner. Just one moment. Sir, in the very back there.
First of all, us allowing them to get into this Alice Malvinas was a direct contravention of the Monroe Doctrine. But anyway, I wanted to ask. I had thought, you know, because I really didn't know there was any chemical weapons exposure other than that bunker, so I was pretty surprised about that. But what I was wondering is, I still have not. I mean, I've seen some exposés like by Michael Fumento, which I'm sure a lot of people here would hate, that show that they didn't really have that much of a greater frequency of anything over the general population. Now, what I want to know though is how much of the disability you think might be caused by the psychological stress of engaging in such a turkey shoot war for such bogus geopolitical aims as, you know, the Thatcher-Bush coalition?
Well, the basic question is, do I believe that there are a significant percentage of Gulf War veterans who are suffering psychosomatic illnesses, essentially? How much does PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder play a role in Gulf War veterans' illnesses? What I will say to you is that the University of Texas Southwest Medical Center, in the study they published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in January of this year, when they examined 247 of the 606 members of a U.S. CB unit, or Naval Mobile Construction Battalion, that has exhibited a tremendous amount of illness, they found no evidence of stress whatsoever. And in fact, the only stress that those veterans complained about was being told that it was all in their heads. I'm familiar with Mr. Fomento's work. I will tell you that in all likelihood, if Mr. Fomento was ever encountered in a dark alley by Gulf War veterans, it wouldn't be pretty. In the back, sir?
Yes, sir. I think you're very sincere in your concern for the veterans, but we were a little shortchanged on your answer that the gentleman asked about the need for us to be there. I remember it very well. I don't think there's ever going to be a time I will ever forget. The day the war started, many of us were arrested. It was Martin Luther King's birthday. Now, as I remember it, Saddam Hussein came into Kuwait because there was some slant drilling being done. Now, if you're concerned about Saudi Arabia, I had thought there was adequate assurances and UN troops that were making sure that that wouldn't happen. And he had agreed to leave. There would be a Middle East peace conference. I never saw the World Court try and say anything. Don't you think that the CIA, George Bush was president at the time, had done a lot of stuff to destabilize that? There's a massacre that happened there. If you're really concerned about the veterans, don't you think those letters that we'd write would have some element in there to make sure that this kind of war would never, ever happen again? We would never, ever manufacture this need that there would be this type of blood for oil. I think that's the real way to protect our veterans.
And the Iraqi children.
Well,
Iraqi children.
The basic question here and statement, if you will, is if we're concerned about veterans and we're concerned about trying to prevent a repetition of this kind of scenario, you know, what's necessarily the best way to approach that? And I would submit to you that, in my view, the only way that you can prevent that kind of thing from happening again is if you have people in Congress who are really willing to challenge executive authority and raise tough questions, and particularly keep an eye on the executive branch